May 24, 1940. 11:30 a.m. The ground of northern France shuddered violently under the weight of thousands of tons of steel. The 1st Panzer Division, under the command of Lieutenant General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, was surging forward with unstoppable speed. Before them, less than 15 miles away, lay the port of Dunkirk. It was the only way out, the final lifeline for the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and the remnants of the French army. Guderian peered through his binoculars. He could smell victory. It was no longer an abstract concept. It was tangible, right there before his eyes. The Allies were broken. They were fleeing in chaos, abandoning heavy weapons, trucks, and artillery along the roads leading to the sea. British soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, were being hemmed into a narrow strip of land, their backs to the sea, facing the gun barrels of the invincible Panzer III and IV tanks. By all conventional military logic, this was the moment to deliver the killing blow. An armored fist punching straight through the final, fragile defensive line would sever Dunkirk. 400,000 troops. The entire core of the British Army would be annihilated or taken prisoner. If that happened, Britain would lose its ability to defend itself. The war, for all intents and purposes, would end right there on the coast of France in May 1940. The German tank crews were ready. Engines roared. Shells were loaded. Adrenaline pumped through the veins of every gunner. They knew that history was within their sights. But at that precise life-or-death moment, the unthinkable happened. An order came down from Army Group A Command, bearing the signature of Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt and approved by Adolf Hitler himself. Halt. Not a stop to refuel, not a stop to repair, but a stop to the attack. Guderian was stunned. He slammed his hand against the side of his command vehicle. He demanded confirmation of the order. Perhaps the radio operator had misheard? Perhaps this was a trick by British intelligence? But no, the order was repeated, cold and definitive. Panzer units are to halt on the line of the Aa Canal. Crossing is forbidden. The silence that enveloped the panzer divisions was more terrifying than the sound of bombs. The steel monsters, designed never to stop until the enemy was crushed, now lay silent on the lush green fields of France. German tank commanders looked at each other, bewildered. Before them was prey lying on the chopping block. Why had the hunter lowered his gun? On the other side of the line, in foxholes hastily dug on the beaches of Dunkirk, British soldiers had no idea they had just received a reprieve from the enemy himself. They only noticed that the clanking of tank tracks, the sound that had haunted them for 2 weeks, had suddenly ceased. They didn't know that this decision to stop was the single greatest military mistake of World War II, a fateful pause that would change the course of human history forever. But why? What was going on in Adolf Hitler's mind on the morning of May 24th? Was it excessive caution? Was it a mad political calculation? Or was it the fear of an invisible trap that only he could see? To understand this decision, we cannot just look at the military maps of 1940. We must travel back in time, dive deep into Hitler's paranoid mind, and peel back the layers of internal conflict, tearing apart the Nazi high command. To understand the silence at the Aa Canal, we must leave the muddy tracks of the panzer tanks and step into the tense, smoke-filled map room of Army Group A headquarters in Charleville. Here, a different kind of war was being fought, not with shells, but with egos, paranoia, and the ghosts of the past. It is vital to realize that Adolf Hitler in May 1940 was not yet the supreme, unquestioned warlord he would later become. He was a man deeply insecure, haunted by the memories of World War I. He had seen the German army come within grasping distance of Paris in 1914, only to be thrown back by the miracle of the Marne. The fear of a sudden Allied counterattack on his exposed flanks was a nightmare that kept him awake at night. General Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group A, was an old-school Prussian officer, cautious, methodical, and conservative. On the morning of May 24th, he looked at his panzer divisions. They were strung out, their supply lines stretched thin, and nearly 50% of their vehicles were in need of maintenance after weeks of lightning-fast advances. Rundstedt saw the marshy terrain of Flanders ahead a graveyard for tanks, and he blinked. He suggested a pause to regroup and let the infantry catch up. For Hitler, Rundstedt's hesitation was the validation he needed. It wasn't just military prudence, it was a lifeline for his anxiety. He flew to Rundstedt's headquarters, and in a meeting that would decide the fate of the world, he nodded. The tanks must be preserved, he declared. In his mind, the real battle was not Dunkirk. It was the upcoming conquest of Paris to the south. Why risk his precious panzers in the mud of Flanders when the war was practically won? But there was another voice in Hitler's ear, one dripping with arrogance and ambition. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, saw an opportunity for glory. He despised the army generals and wanted the victory for himself. He called Hitler, his voice booming with confidence. My Luftwaffe can complete the destruction of the enemy in the pocket. The tanks are not needed. Let me bomb them into submission. It was a seductive promise. It appealed to Hitler's vanity and his desire to assert control over the army high command. By halting the tanks and letting the Air Force finish the job, Hitler could save his armor for Paris and remind his generals who was really in charge. And so, the order stood. Back on the front lines, General Halted, the chief of the general staff, was furious. He wrote in his diary that the order was insane. He watched helplessly as the golden hour for annihilation slipped away. The German tank crews climbed out of their hatches, lighting cigarettes, watching the distant smoke of Dunkirk, confused and frustrated. They were predators on a leash. Meanwhile, inside the Dunkirk perimeter, the miracle began to take shape. The British, realizing the pressure had lifted, didn't waste a second. They began to tighten their defensive lines. They flooded the fields to create anti-tank barriers. And across the English Channel, in the command rooms of Dover, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay received the signal. He began to mobilize every floating vessel he could find, destroyers, ferries, fishing boats, and pleasure yachts. The pause that Hitler thought was a masterstroke of caution was rapidly turning into the only window of survival the British would get. The weather was turning. The skies were clouding over. Göring's Luftwaffe was about to face an enemy he hadn't accounted for, the fog of the English Channel. While the panzer tanks sat silent on the canal line, cooling their engines in the spring air, the sky over Dunkirk began to scream. Hermann Göring was determined to keep his promise to Hitler. He wanted to prove that the Luftwaffe alone could crush the trapped Allied army, rendering the traditional aristocracy of the army irrelevant. On May 27th, he unleashed hell. The air filled with the terrifying, high-pitched wail of Jericho trumpets, the sirens mounted on the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. This was psychological warfare at its finest. The sound was designed to paralyze men with fear before the bombs even landed. Thousands of high-explosive bombs rained down on the town of Dunkirk. The ancient port city was pulverized. The docks, vital for loading heavy equipment and troops onto large transport ships, were reduced to twisted metal and burning timber. The oil refineries along the harbor were hit, sending thick, black columns of toxic smoke thousands of feet into the air. The smoke was so dense it turned day into night, choking the men on the beaches and coating their lungs with soot. But amidst this inferno, Göring made a critical miscalculation, one that would cost him dearly. He had bombed the town and the docks, yes, but the soft sand of the beaches absorbed the shock of the bombs, minimizing the shrapnel damage to the soldiers scattered across the dunes. And the wreckage in the harbor, meant to trap the British, actually created a new, desperate opportunity. With the docks destroyed, the British found a lifeline, the East Mole. It was a flimsy, wooden breakwater stretching nearly a mile out into the sea, designed to influence tidal currents, not to dock ships. It had no railings, it was narrow, but to the desperate men of the BEF, it looked like a bridge to salvation. While the Luftwaffe pounded the earth, the halt order was finally lifted on May 26th. The German tanks roared back to life. But the 48-hour window of opportunity had slammed shut. The pause had given the British just enough time to fortify their perimeter. The chaotic rabble Guderian had seen 2 days earlier was now a dug-in, desperate force fighting with the ferocity of men who had nowhere left to run. Every village, every farmhouse, and every canal crossing on the outskirts of Dunkirk became a fortress. The British rearguard fought with suicidal bravery, buying time with their blood. Every hour they held the German tanks back was another hour for the evacuation to organize. And organize it did. In the tunnels of Dover Castle, Vice Admiral Ramsay was orchestrating the impossible. He realized that the destroyers and large transports were sitting ducks for the Stukas and U-boats. He needed targets that were too small to hit and too numerous to count. The call went out. It wasn't a military order. It was a plea to the nation, the little ships. From the muddy estuaries of the Thames to the yacht clubs of the south coast, a strange and ragtag armada began to assemble. Lifeboats, pleasure cruisers, fishing trawlers, fire tugs, and weekend sailboats. Civilians, fathers, sons, retirees stepped onto their decks, checking their fuel gauges and setting a course for the pillars of black smoke on the horizon. They were sailing into a war zone with no armor, no weapons, and often no maps. But they were coming. Back on the beaches, the soldiers didn't know help was on the way. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the water, waiting. They watched the Stukas dive. They watched the German tanks inch closer to the perimeter. And they prayed. The stage was set for the greatest escape in military history. But for Hitler, the Halt order was beginning to curdle from a tactical pause into a strategic catastrophe. He had hesitated, and in war, hesitation is the sibling of defeat. The dawn of May 28th broke over a seascape that looked less like a military operation and more like a hallucination. For the soldiers standing neck-deep in the oily, freezing water of the English Channel, hope had been a mathematical impossibility. They were trapped between the crushing weight of the German army and the cold indifference of the sea. But then they saw it. It started as a speckling on the horizon, like a swarm of insects dancing on the water. As it drew closer, the shape of the rescue fleet became clear, and it was unlike anything seen in the history of naval warfare. There were no mighty battleships. Instead, there were paddle steamers that usually carried tourists on the Thames. There were Dutch barges stinking of onions. There were lifeboats stolen from liners, expensive yachts owned by bankers, and fishing trawlers still smelling of the morning catch. This was the Mosquito Fleet Operation Dynamo, in its most chaotic, beautiful form. The water around Dunkirk was too shallow for the large Royal Navy destroyers to get close to the beach. They had to anchor miles out. This is where the little ships became the arteries of the evacuation. Under constant fire from the Luftwaffe, civilians and sailors piloted these tiny craft right into the surf. They picked up soldiers 10, 20, 30 at a time, ferried them out to the waiting destroyers, and then turned back to do it again. It was a scene of industrial-scale slaughter mixed with individual heroism. Stuka dive bombers screamed down, their pilots picking off specific boats like sharks hunting seals. Columns of water erupted into the sky as bombs missed their targets, capsizing smaller vessels with their shock waves alone. But for every boat that sank, 2 more seemed to take its place. On the perimeter, the consequences of Hitler's Halt order were now being paid for in blood. The German tanks, finally unleashed, slammed into the British defenses, but the British were no longer the disorganized rabble of May 24th. They had used the 48-hour reprieve to turn every hedgerow and canal into a kill zone. At places like Kassel and Hazebrouck, small pockets of British and French troops fought to the last bullet. They knew they weren't going home. Their orders were simple: hold the line at all costs. Every hour they held back, the panzer divisions was another 1,000 men lifted off the beaches. The Halt order had given the Allies the one thing money cannot buy in war: time. General Guderian watched his tanks struggle to break through positions that, 2 days earlier, had been undefended. He raged at the sky. He realized with a sinking heart that the easy victory had evaporated. The trap had holes in it. Back on the East Mole, the fragile wooden walkway jutting out into the sea, the evacuation was reaching a fever pitch. Despite the constant bombing, the mole remained miraculously intact. It became a highway of humanity. Destroyers risked running aground to pull alongside it, loading hundreds of men in minutes. But as the miracle of Dunkirk unfolded, a darker reality was setting in for the French. As the British boarded the boats, the French army held the perimeter, fighting with a desperation that is often forgotten by history. They were buying tickets for a boat ride they would likely never take. And high above, in his command post, Hitler received the reports. The numbers of captured prisoners were low, too low. The beaches were emptying. The annihilation he had promised his generals was slipping through his fingers like sand. The mistake was no longer a tactical error. It was becoming a strategic catastrophe. While the cameras of history have largely focused on the little ships bobbing in the surf, a much grimmer, bloodier reality was unfolding just a few miles inland. This is the part of the Dunkirk story that often gets cut from the highlight reels, but without it, the miracle would have been a massacre. As the evacuation peaked on May 29th and 30th, the German war machine was finally back in motion. The panzer divisions, unleashed from their leash, were furious. They slammed into the shrinking Allied pocket with the intention of wiping out everyone left. But they ran into a wall of steel and flesh that they hadn't expected. At the town of Lille, roughly 40,000 French soldiers of the First Army, under the command of General Molinier, were encircled. They were cut off from the beaches. They had no hope of rescue. They knew, with chilling clarity, that for them, the war was over. But instead of surrendering, they chose to fight. For 4 days, this French force held off 7 full German divisions, including General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. They fought house to house, street to street, turning the industrial suburbs of Lille into a meat grinder. They occupied significant German resources that should have been driving toward the beaches. Historians estimate that the defense of Lille bought the evacuation at Dunkirk an additional 4 days. In those 4 days, over 100,000 men were lifted off the beaches. It is a haunting transaction. 40,000 French soldiers traded their freedom, and many, their lives, for the survival of the British Army. When General Molinier finally surrendered on May 31st, the Germans were so impressed by the ferocity of the French defense that they allowed the garrison to parade past them with full military honors, a rare gesture of respect in a brutal war. Meanwhile, back on the beaches, the situation was becoming apocalyptic. The Luftwaffe, stung by their failure to stop the Mosquito fleet, redoubled their efforts. The air over Dunkirk was a chaotic swirl of dogfights. The Royal Air Force, RAF, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes, was engaging the German bombers before they could reach the beaches. But because these battles happened high above the clouds or miles inland, the soldiers on the beach rarely saw them. Bitterly, many cursed the RAF, asking, "Where are our planes?" They didn't know that young British pilots were dying by the dozen just out of sight to keep the Stukas off their backs. By June 2nd, the last of the British Expeditionary Force had left. The signal was sent to London. BEF evacuated. But the story wasn't over. On the beaches, 40,000 French troops remained, the rearguard who had held the perimeter while their British allies escaped. On the night of June 3rd, the final ships, mostly older destroyers and ferries, made one last, desperate run into the harbor. They crammed as many French soldiers as they could into the holds. But as dawn broke on June 4th, the Germans finally broke through. The swastika flag was raised over the burning oil tanks of the Dunkirk docks. On the beach, amidst the wreckage of abandoned trucks, helmets, and rifles, nearly 40,000 French soldiers were marched into captivity. Hitler had won the battle for France. He stood triumphant. But as he looked at the empty beaches, a cold realization began to settle in the minds of his more astute generals. They had captured the territory, yes. They had captured the equipment, yes. But the army, the living, breathing soul of Britain's defense, had vanished. The Halt order had transformed a potential checkmate into a long, drawn-out game that Germany was now destined to lose. The 338,226 men who escaped Dunkirk would become the nucleus of the army that would return to these very shores 4 years later on D-Day. On June 5th, 1940, the church bells across Germany began to ring. They rang in Berlin, in Munich, and in Hamburg. Nazi flags draped every window. To the German people, and indeed to most of the world, the war appeared to be over. The Wehrmacht had done in 6 weeks what the Kaiser's army couldn't do in 4 years. They had crushed France and humiliated the British Empire. Adolf Hitler was euphoric. In his mind, the Halt order had been vindicated. He had preserved his precious panzer divisions, and they were now rolling south to finish off the remaining French forces and capture Paris. He looked at the map and saw Europe under his thumb. He believed, with absolute certainty, that Britain, stripped of its European allies and its army battered, would now come to the negotiating table. He didn't want to invade Britain. He wanted them to accept German dominance on the continent so he could turn his eyes toward his true obsession, Russia. But while Berlin celebrated, a very different scene was playing out on the southern coast of England. The trains arriving at Victoria and Waterloo stations were filled with men who looked like ghosts. They were unshaven, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollowed by the trauma of the beaches. They had no kit bags. Most had no rifles. They were an army of scarecrows. The material cost of Dunkirk was staggering. The British Expeditionary Force had left behind virtually everything they owned in France. On the beaches and roads leading to Dunkirk lay the wreckage of a superpower. 63,000 vehicles, 2,400 artillery guns, 90,000 rifles, and 500,000 tons of supplies. Britain essentially had no heavy weapons left to defend its own island. If Hitler had ignored his own halt order and crushed the army on the beach, or if he had immediately launched an invasion, Operation Sea Lion, in June 1940, history would have been written in German. But Hitler hesitated again. He waited by the telephone. He expected a call from Winston Churchill. He expected reason. Instead, he got a roar. On June 4th, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons. He didn't sugarcoat the disaster. He called it a colossal military disaster. But then, he did something that no German general could understand. He turned a tactical defeat into a moral victory. "We shall go on to the end," Churchill growled. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." This speech was the psychological turning point of the war. Hitler had calculated the war based on tanks, divisions, and territory. He had not calculated the sheer stubbornness of the British people. The Halt order had allowed 338,000 men to return home, and though they brought no guns, they brought back something far more dangerous to the Third Reich, the Dunkirk spirit. The narrative shifted overnight. The soldiers weren't survivors of a defeat, they were heroes of a miracle. The civilians who had sailed the little ships felt invested in the war in a way no propaganda poster could achieve. They had touched the war. They had saved their sons. Hitler, baffled by Britain's refusal to surrender, spent crucial weeks in the summer of 1940, hesitating yet again. He couldn't understand why a nation with no army and no guns would keep fighting. He delayed the order for the invasion of Britain, hoping for a diplomatic solution that would never come. That delay, born from the same cautious political mindset that caused the Halt order, gave Britain exactly what it needed: time to regroup, time to rearm, and most importantly, time for the Royal Air Force to prepare for the Battle of Britain. The ghosts of the men Hitler let escape at Dunkirk were about to haunt him in the skies over London. The 16th of July, 1940. Adolf Hitler finally signed Directive No. 16. The codename was Operation Sea Lion. The order was chilling in its simplicity. As England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, still shows no signs of willingness to come to terms, I have decided to prepare a landing operation against, and if necessary, the occupation of, England. On paper, it looked like the inevitable next step. The German Wehrmacht was the finest fighting force the world had ever seen. They had rolled through Poland in weeks and France in days. Surely, crossing 20 miles of water to crush a demoralized, disarmed nation would be a formality. But as the planning began, the Halt order at Dunkirk began to reveal its second, more insidious consequence. Hitler looked at the English Channel and saw a wide river. The German generals looked at it and saw a grave. Germany was a continental power. Its army was designed to fight on land, not on water. The Kriegsmarine, German Navy, had been decimated during the campaign in Norway earlier that year. They lacked the destroyers to protect an invasion fleet. They lacked the landing craft to put tanks on a beach. Their plan for crossing the channel relied on river barges, towed by tugboats, slow, unarmored targets that would have been slaughter for the Royal Navy. This is where the survival of the Dunkirk troops became the decisive factor. If the 338,000 men of the BEF had been captured at Dunkirk, the southern coast of Britain would have been empty. Even a haphazard barge-borne German invasion might have succeeded simply because there would have been no one there to stop them. A few thousand German paratroopers capturing a port like Dover could have opened the door for the panzers, but the beaches were not empty. Those scarecrows, who had arrived at Victoria Station in June, were now, by July, re-equipped and dug in. The Dunkirk veterans formed the hard spine of the Home Guard. They manned the coastal defenses. They knew how the Germans fought. They had seen the Stukas and the Panzers, and they were no longer afraid of the unknown. The psychological advantage of the Blitzkrieg, the terror of the invincible enemy, had been broken on the sands of Dunkirk. Hitler realized that he could not launch an invasion as long as the British Army was waiting and the Royal Navy controlled the sea. There was only one card left to play. Before the barges could sail, the Royal Air Force, RAF, had to be eliminated. And so, the Battle of Dunkirk bled directly into the Battle of Britain. Hermann Göring, still stinging from his failure to stop the evacuation, promised Hitler once again, "I will scour the English sky." He believed that if the Luftwaffe could destroy the RAF fighters and bomb the coastal defenses, the invasion could proceed. The soldiers on the ground in Kent and Sussex looked up. The summer sky, usually filled with skylarks, began to fill with the drone of Heinkel bombers and the whine of Messerschmitts. The men who had survived the beaches of France now watched the contrails weaving above them, knowing that their survival had simply bought them a ticket to the main event. The Halt order had not only saved the British Army, it had forced Germany into a type of warfare it was not prepared for: an air and naval war against an island nation that had ruled the waves for centuries. Hitler had hesitated at the crucial moment on land, and now he was being forced to fight in the sky, where his tanks were useless. August 13, 1944. Atlatag Eagle Day. The consequences of the Dunkirk Halt order had now fully matured into a contest of attrition that the world had never seen before. Having failed to crush the British Army on the sands of France, Hitler was now forced to try and crush the British spirit from the air. Hermann Göring, seeking redemption for his failure at Dunkirk, threw the full weight of the Luftwaffe against the Royal Air Force. He had 2,500 planes, bombers and fighters massed across the Channel in occupied France. Facing them were fewer than 700 serviceable British fighters. On paper, it was a mismatch. It should have been a slaughter. But the Germans were walking into a trap of their own making, a trap born of arrogance and a lack of intelligence, the same flaws that had led to the Halt order. While the Germans had better planes in many respects, the British had something the Germans didn't understand: the chain home. It was the world's first integrated radar defense system. Along the coast of England, strange metal towers stared out across the Channel, seeing the invisible. When the German squadrons took off from France, they believed they were launching surprise attacks. But before they even crossed the coastline, they were already being tracked. In the operations rooms deep underground, young women were pushing plotting markers across large maps, guiding the Spitfires and Hurricanes to the exact altitude and location of the enemy. The British pilots, the few, as Churchill called them, were exhausted. They were flying 5-6 sorties a day. They were landing only to refuel, rearm, and sleep for 20 minutes before scrambling again. But they had a secret weapon. They were fighting over their own soil. If a German pilot was shot down, he was captured. If a British pilot was shot down, he could parachute out, have a cup of tea in a farmhouse, and be back in a fresh plane by the afternoon. By late August, the RAF was at its breaking point. The Luftwaffe was relentlessly bombing the airfields, destroying the infrastructure that kept the British flying. It was working. The British defense was beginning to crumble. The invasion barges were being readied in France. And then, history repeated itself. Just like at Dunkirk, Hitler made a catastrophic emotional decision that overrode military logic. On the night of August 24th, a stray German bomber, lost in the dark, accidentally dropped its payload on central London. It was a mistake, not a calculated attack. But Churchill, seeing an opportunity to strike a psychological blow, ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The damage to Berlin was minimal, but the damage to Hitler's ego was massive. He had promised the German people that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the capital. Enraged, he went to the microphone and screamed, "If they attack our cities, we will erase theirs." On September 7th, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to switch targets. They stopped bombing the RAF airfields, which were days away from collapse, and began bombing London. It was the Halt order all over again. Just when the German military had their boot on the throat of the enemy, Hitler changed the objective. By attacking London, he caused terrible suffering to civilians, but he gave the RAF airfields a critical reprieve. The runways were repaired. The pilots slept. The production lines churned out new Spitfires. When the Luftwaffe returned in force on September 15th, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, They expected to find a dead air force. Instead, they ran into a wall of fresh, organized, and ferocious British fighters. The Luftwaffe was mauled. They lost 60 aircraft in a single day. The German pilots, looking down at the English countryside, realized the horrible truth. The invasion was impossible. The British were not defeated, they were getting stronger. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The barges were dispersed. The invasion was off. The men who had waded into the water at Dunkirk and the pilots who covered them had done the impossible. They had forced the Nazi war machine to blink. Hitler, now frustrated and blocked in the west, turned his eyes to the east, toward the Soviet Union. He was about to walk into the biggest graveyard in history, leaving an undefeated Britain at his back, a strategic nightmare that began the moment he told his tanks to stop at the Aa Canal. As 1941 dawned, the map of Europe was almost entirely Nazi-controlled. From the Pyrenees in Spain to the border of Poland, the swastika flew unopposed. But there was one glaring exception, the island of Great Britain. This is where the true long-term catastrophe of the Dunkirk Halt order began to manifest. By allowing the British army to escape and the British nation to survive, Hitler had inadvertently created an unsinkable aircraft carrier right on his doorstep. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in human history. 3 million German soldiers surged east. Hitler was confident. He believed the war in the West was effectively over, a stalemate he could ignore. He was wrong. Because Britain was still in the fight, Germany was forced to fight a two-front war, the very nightmare that had destroyed Germany in World War I. Even as German panzers were freezing at the gates of Moscow, Hitler had to keep hundreds of thousands of his best troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and vast squadrons of the Luftwaffe stationed in France, guarding the coast against a British invasion that he knew would eventually come. Those troops sitting idle in France could have tipped the balance at Stalingrad. The planes guarding the French coast could have protected the German Sixth Army. But they were pinned down in the west, paralyzed by the mere existence of the British army, the same army that Hitler had let slip through his fingers at Dunkirk. Furthermore, the Halt order had saved the cadres, the officers, sergeants, and veterans. These men were now the instructors, training a new generation of soldiers. And soon, they were training an even bigger giant, the Americans. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States entered the war. If Britain had fallen in 1940, the U.S. would have had no base from which to liberate Europe. A transatlantic invasion from New York to Normandy would have been logistically impossible, but because Britain stood firm, the U.S. had a massive staging ground. By 1942, the skies over Germany began to turn black, not with storm clouds, but with bombers. The Royal Air Force by night, and the U.S. Army Air Forces by day, began the systematic destruction of German industry. The factories that built the panzers, the refineries that produced the fuel, the railways that moved the troops, all were pounded into dust. Where did these bombers fly from? From the airfields of England. Every bomb that fell on Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden could trace its lineage back to that single order on the 24th of May 1940. If Hitler had taken Dunkirk, there would have been no base for the bombers. If there were no bombers, German industry would have remained intact. If German industry had remained intact, the war on the Eastern Front might have ended very differently. The Halt order was no longer just a military blunder. It was a slow-acting poison that was killing the Third Reich from the inside out. Hitler had wanted to save his tanks for a future battle, but by doing so, he ensured that those tanks would eventually run out of fuel, ammunition, and air cover. And as 1,943 turned into 1,944, the men who had been pulled out of the water at Dunkirk began to look at their maps again. They weren't looking at defensive lines anymore. They were looking at the beaches of Normandy. They were coming back. The 6th of June, 1944. Dawn. 4 years and 12 days after the last British soldier left the burning beaches of Dunkirk, the English Channel was once again filled with ships. But this time, it was not a ragtag fleet of fishing trawlers and pleasure yachts fleeing a massacre. This was the greatest armada the world had ever seen. 7,000 vessels. 156,000 men, 10,000 aircraft. As the landing craft lowered their ramps onto the sands of Normandy just a few hundred miles down the coast from Dunkirk, the Wehrmacht soldiers peering out of their bunkers witnessed the ultimate consequence of Adolf Hitler's mistake. Among the waves of men storming Sword, Juno, and Gold Beaches were the veterans of 1,940. The privates who had shivered in the water at Dunkirk were now battle-hardened sergeants and captains. They had returned, and they had brought their friends, the Americans and the Canadians, with them. General Bernard Montgomery, who had commanded a division at Dunkirk with cool professionalism during the retreat, was now the commander of all Allied ground forces. He knew the German army. He respected them, but he no longer feared them. He had seen them hesitate once, and he knew they could be beaten. The irony was crushing. The panzer divisions that Hitler had so desperately wanted to preserve in 1940 were now scattered and overwhelmed. When the invasion began, Hitler was asleep at the Berghof. His generals, terrified of his temper, refused to wake him to release the panzer reserves. Once again, at the critical moment, the German tanks were frozen by indecision. By the time Hitler woke up, the Allies had a foothold. The unsinkable aircraft carrier of Britain had successfully launched its invasion. The road from Normandy to Berlin was long and bloody, but the outcome was inevitable. The German army fought with tenacity, but they were being crushed by a strategic vice that had been forged years earlier. From the east, the Soviet steamroller, which Hitler had underestimated, was closing in. From the west, the Anglo-American forces, which Hitler had allowed to survive, were driving straight for the Rhine. On the 30th of April 1945, deep in his bunker in Berlin, as the Soviet artillery shook the dust from the ceiling, Adolf Hitler took his own life. Above him, the thousand-year Reich lay in ruins. Historians will argue forever about the specifics of the war, the jet fighters, the atomic bomb, the Enigma code. But if you retrace the timeline, if you follow the thread of causality back through the smoke and the fire, it leads to a single, quiet morning in northern France. It leads back to the 24th of May 1940, to a field of green grass by the Aa Canal, to a line of panzer tanks sitting idle, their engines off, their commanders confused. That was the moment the door to victory was open. That was the moment Germany could have won the war. But the door was slammed shut, not by the enemy, but by the conqueror himself. The Halt order remains the most profound what-if of the 20th century. It serves as a brutal lesson in leadership. In war, as in life, momentum is everything. And sometimes, the decision to stop is the only mistake you can't recover from.